This is the second of two lessons where we're going to take a look at the reforms from the Progressive Era that dealt with the problems of the industrial age. This time we're going to focus on what happened under President Woodrow Wilson. As you can see here, Wilson was a two-term president. We know from the previous lesson he was governor of New Jersey prior to this. He was also the head of Princeton University before this. And he was a Democrat, unlike President Teddy Roosevelt, who was a Republican. Wilson's campaign slogan was New Freedom, and this involved putting additional limits on corporations. We're going to take a look at how exactly this played out in a moment. Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act in 1913 because from time to time financial panics would grip the nation. The most recent prior to this was the Panic of 1907. Without getting into the nitty-gritty details, the intent of this act was to smooth out and ideally eliminate these panics that occurred. You can see here it created 12 district Federal Reserve banks that had the power to issue paper currency and loan banks money, including setting the prime interest rate. The Federal Reserve System's impact on monetary policy is huge, and it's very significant on our lives as well, given that the Fed, as it's known, has the ability to set key interest rates upon which all other interest rates are based. You can see here from the map that the Federal Reserve System is divided into 12 districts. Each district has the ability to print money, which is why when you look at your money, dollar, paper currency, you'll see that it may have been printed in one of these 12 areas that you see here on the map. Each area has a governor of that region, and they meet, I want to say they meet monthly, I'm not entirely sure, but they meet regularly at their Board of Governors meeting, and the chairman of the Fed is chosen by the president for a 10-year period. Your takeaway from this that you really need to know for the Regents exam is what you see on the screen here, that the Fed regulates the nation's money supply, but they do much more than that. If we look here at 2014, you'll notice that interest rates are extremely low. You can borrow money for cars at 0%, and that's because the interest rate that banks pay each other to borrow money from each other right now is just about 0% or extremely close to 0%. That rate is set by the Fed. This is wonderful if you need to borrow money right now, because interest rates for mortgages and cars and other things you might need to borrow money for are very low, which is wonderful. However, if you're on the other side and you're trying to save money, or you're living on a fixed income that retirees are, for example, it's difficult to earn interest on your savings because your savings accounts are paying a fraction of a percent right now as well. So right now we are currently living in a time that is difficult for savers, terrific if you need to borrow money. And this is directly related to Fed policy at this moment in time. The Federal Reserve System, Federal Reserve Board, is not without its controversy today, but as this cartoon indicates, it was not without controversy at the time it was created either. The concern was that they were going to create and have created a governing board that is not elected, that has tremendous power over our financial system. You can see here it's depicted in the octopus-like monster that has gripped politics. The U.S. Treasury is in its grip. Banks are in its grip. The stock exchange operates. I should say that Fed policies and changing interest rates have a significant impact on the stock market as well. So they have a tremendous control over the national economy. Another criticism of the Fed, as is depicted in this chart, is the ability of the Fed to print money as it sees fit to do. Because as we print more money, the purchasing power of the money declines over time. As you can see here, in 1913 dollar today would, in 2001, would purchase about 4 cents worth of stuff today, and that's due directly to inflation or rising prices, which this chart suggests is due to the continual printing of money. I have oversimplified what the Federal Reserve does in an attempt to try and give you an understanding of how it operates. It really is quite complicated, but your real takeaway from that, again, is that the Fed regulates the nation's money supply, and also simply that it is not without controversy. Moving along, we're going to take a look at the Clayton Antitrust Act, the Federal Trade Act. You can see here again with the Clayton Act, the Sherman Antitrust Act was strengthened because it made monopolies illegal. All right. Additionally, the Federal Trade Act creates the Federal Trade Commission, which now has the ability to investigate unfair business practices. So these laws, these two laws, the Clayton Act and the Federal Trade Act, gave the federal government more power to go after companies that were acting anti-competitively. We need to turn our attention to 4 amendments that were added to the Constitution during the Progressive Era. The 16th Amendment you see here granted Congress the power to create an income tax. And Congress had created an income tax prior to this amendment. The Supreme Court had struck that down as unconstitutional. Hence the need to add the amendment to the Constitution. The idea being that with all of these new agencies that have been created and inspectors and whatnot, government needed a more steady source of revenue. Hence the income tax, the tax that everybody loves to hate. The 17th Amendment was meant to clean up the U.S. Senate. U.S. senators, as explained in the Constitution, were chosen by the legislatures of the states. I've explained in the lesson prior to this that the state legislatures were pretty corrupt, so it stands to reason they were going to pick people to serve in the Senate that were not the most moral people, and they weren't. And the U.S. senators were subject to manipulation by the monopolists, bribe-taking, if you will, by the monopolists. And the 17th Amendment was meant to clean up the U.S. Senate because now people were going to elect their senators directly, and those senators were now answerable to the people of their state. Amendment 18 we're going to talk about in a future unit, but you should know when we talk about the moral aspect of the Progressive Era, we're talking about the temperance movement, which was the movement to ban alcohol, and you can see here from Amendment 18 that that was successful. We're going to talk about Amendment 19 in the very next lesson and our last lesson in this unit when we look at issues affecting women during the Progressive Era. But you can see here you can see here that women did gain the right to vote in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. So just to sum up then, President Wilson's reforms further limited the power of corporations, strengthened the federal government's ability to go after them for anti-competitive practices. The government created the Federal Reserve System, which again regulates the nation's money supply. And lastly, 4 amendments were added to the Constitution during the Progressive Era. Amendment 16 with the income tax, Amendment 17, direct election of senators, 18 made alcohol illegal, and 19 gave women the right to vote. The next lesson, again, we are going to focus on women's issues during this time period.